Okay. Switch them the other way, same thing. And sometimes it takes a couple of times to do it. And again, and go just back and forth a few times, back and forth. So again, you're just putting your hands like that back and then switching them the other way. Great. Great. And there's some other things we can do too, but we'll talk about this in a minute. Let me plug in here just a sec. Okay, can you hear this as well? Is that okay? Yeah, great. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So, hi, Michael. Hi, Alyssa. Hi, Robin. So, one other thing. Let's put, just bring a finger in front of you, dead center, if you can. And think about a figure 8 on its side or an infinity symbol. And without moving your head, I just want you to make very slowly and following with your eyes an infinity symbol with your finger. And just follow it slowly in one direction. Hopefully you won't fall off your chair as you do this. That's fine. So see if you can just follow that. And come back to the center. And now do it in the other direction. Start in the other direction and just follow that. Fantastic. Nobody's fallen off the chair. We're good. So, okay. And then back to center. Terrific. So you know, this is very interesting, the use of sort of bilateral motion. So whether you're doing it with your arms like this, or whether you're doing it in walking, or there are all sorts of other things that lots of folks are arguing that this helps helps to balance hemispheres, essentially. And there's some evidence that supports that. One of the more interesting aspects of using the eyes, though, has come along these days in things like EMDR, eye movement desensitization response in psychotherapy, and brain spotting, which is a kind of a derivative of this as well. What we know in previous 30 years ago or so, NLP, sorry, neuro-linguistic programming, also really took a lot of interest in eye movement and argued that that was really useful in terms of both recognizing how we access information. For example, if you're looking up to the left, you're remembering something visually. If you're down, you're often sort of having a kinesthetic experience, a body experience. So it's very useful in terms of making contact with people. I was trained as a psychotherapist originally, so that kind of stuff was really interesting, to try to make contact with folks and try to track and understand where they were coming from. The thing with EMDR and brain spotting and this eye movement thing, though, is that fascinatingly, it does look like, for whatever reason, eye movement is really neurologically connected to places pretty deep in the brain. So the principle of things like EMDR and eye movement and so forth is, in general, is that you're actually doing a deep neural stimulation or activation in a non-invasive way. So really fascinating stuff. And the foremost psychotherapists on trauma, people like Besser van der Kolk and so forth, he's just all into things like EMDR, which sounds like voodoo. So anyway, it's really, really fascinating. Anyway, so how does this relate to the body and so forth? Well, part of what that does, allegedly, is, again, to really activate hemispheres and so forth. So part of the idea is, how do you get in a mindset ready for skill set? So all the things we've done are just very, very simple things that you might do anyway: breathing, movement, this kind of thing. The bilateral stimulation is playful and so forth. Good elementary school teacher, a good university teacher knows how to do this and play with it. Here's another one before we get into theoretical stuff. I'm going to do this and do your best to see if you can follow. So. Can you see okay?
Were you going to share a screen? Because I just see you still. Okay.
No, it's just this one. It's just this screen. So.
All right. Yep. Nope. We see you.
Okay. So, Paul Ekman has made a career on the 43 muscles of the face and how they're neurologically connected to the limbic system, to emotional activation, neurologically. And so a movement like that really isn't just about making a face, but it's instead actually pulling the emotional system along simply from physical movement. We know this about posture as well. We know this about looking down versus looking up. For several thousand years, Buddhists would say, look, if you're a little more active in your mind when you're meditating, look down. If you're a little logy, look up. So there's some interesting history with this. But one of the things that happens though with something like the smile, particularly if we do it together, that is, if you do it with somebody else, if you're making eye contact with somebody, if you're breathing with somebody, if you're looking, is that you're activating the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve, Stephen Porges really has put this on the map, right? And this is called the social engagement system. Neurologically, the social engagement system. And basically what it does is, in part, that kind of move, smiling, eye contact with somebody else, a couple deep breaths, actually calms us down. When we think about what children are dealing with these days and what they come in with, anything that can help us settle down so that we have a kind of priming, so that then we can be ready for the work at hand. So whether that's physically doing some exercises, if it means smiling at one another for a few minutes, if it means a few moments even, that activates the social engagement system and calms us down. And of course, the social engagement system is largely about empathy. So the sort of backstory of this, it helps us really engage one another. Dan Goleman tells a wonderful story in his book, Social Intelligence, about an army troop who are going into a city center in Iraq after one of our invasions, and they're trying to sort of make sure that things are settled and and maybe it's 10 fellows, and they're walking in and they're in full battle gear, and they walk in and all of a sudden they notice that there's somebody on a roof, and then there's somebody behind a pillar, and then there's somebody walking towards them, and pretty soon these 10 fellows with their full battle gear on are surrounded by maybe 100 or 120 men. And the men are remarkably, you can just feel the tension and you can feel the anger. And the lieutenant who is in charge issues 3 commands very quickly, because suddenly they're surrounded and this can go very, very badly. So the first one, he says, lower your weapons. The second one, he says, take a knee. And they take a knee. The wagons are circled, they're facing out at this point. Do you know what the third one is that he said? Smile. Yeah, smile. And so there they are, this group of guys. And
I hate to interrupt. I don't know if it was my screen or yours, but you froze and I missed this first one.
Oh.
Was the second one take a knee?
Take a knee. Yeah.
The first was,
The first was lower your weapons,
ah.
take a knee, and then smile.
Mm.
And it took no more than a minute before this angry mob that was just, ready for whatever, to start loosening up, and actually started to smile back. And a couple minutes go by, and finally they're patting each other on the shoulders, they're patting the soldiers, they're laughing, and the crowd disperses. And so one of the things that happens with this is that our smiling isn't just about us. It isn't just activating our own social engagement system. It's about what we're calling interpersonal neurobiology. It's this linking or looping that happens between us. The old idea of empathy being, oh, I really feel the other person. We've now got good, hard neurological data that says this is happening. It's not just whatever just means, just our experience. It's also, we've got hard evidence of this. So anyway, so this is again, this just different ways that we can prime a situation in the classroom to lower anxiety, to bring the body into the room and use it in some way as a portal, and also use it as an engagement with one another. So anyway, that's our warm up a little bit. So you okay so far? And if you have, I've got you all on this screen. So if you've got something, just do a finger and chime in, unmute and go ahead. We'll just see where we go here. So one of the things that I recognize, and by the way, this talk is really based on a chapter in a book. This is my promotion here, The Integrative Mind, and there are five missing minds, I think, that I talk about in here. One is the contemplative mind, empathic mind, beautiful mind, beauty, imaginative mind, and the last is the embodied mind. Things that we've been missing in contemporary education. So, in one way or another, these all things relate to, I think, to this holistic view that we've been talking about. Anyway, one of the things that I think has happened is that the body's really been left out of the classroom. There's this long tradition in the West from Plato on of moving towards abstraction and leaving the body behind. So Plato, for example, talks about the prison house of the soul. The body is the prison house of the soul. And so while he had many things that we might think of as spiritual, he also really left the body behind. Augustine takes this up in the 4th century or so and makes the body and the earth base, secondary. And he says that the way to God and the way to growth is through the intellect. Through the intellect. So, and Augustine's influence was huge, right? And then we have 400 years ago, Descartes, who separates body and spirit, essentially, and turns the body largely into a machine, something the head rides around on. And so these things have really left behind things like a felt sense, a gut intuition, the clasp of hand to tool. These things are left at the roadside in favor of abstract concepts and categories. So as part of this dismissal of the body is another factor that I think is really important, particularly in the modern age, and that is the emphasis on objectivity. So as well as losing the body behind, this notion of subject observing object, and mostly subject not just observing, but measuring object. And so what this has done is pushed out subjective perception, that feeling of the tool in your hand, that gut sense, that feeling in your heart. Those things have been largely abandoned in favor of abstract conception. When I talk about the body and embodiment, I also talk about the body being embedded in the world. So we're not just sort of a body independent, but we're a body in context, and particularly a body that's of the earth. The word human and humus, which means the word humus means earth, and the word human is derived from that. We're not just on it, we're of it. And so this is part of this return to the environment, this return to the natural world. It's a recognition, a resonance of our home, our how much we're part of it. And yet, again, objectification has taken us out of it. Now, one of the things that the modern mind has done is separate, again, self from the world. Max Weber's term, the disenchantment of the world, is part of the consequence of this segregation and separation. Largely, the world has become a collection of objects, ourselves included. Thomas Berry, the great cultural historian and a priest, he says our move evolutionarily is to go from seeing the world as a collection of objects to experiencing it as a communion of subjects. That's our move. And we can only do that through our body. So one of the things about this objectivist materialist worldview, which has a lot of upsides, is that it has a cost to us, and it costs our consciousness. Richard Tarnas says it this way. He says the achievement of human autonomy, again, separating ourselves from the world, has been paid for by the experience of human alienation. This great ability to objectify has left us in our heads, outside or above the world, and our bodies searching for a way back in. Today, we're not simply looking for a description of life. We're searching for an experience of being alive. And that experience comes from being embodied in the world. This is part of the reason that we see all these things that are extreme these days, extreme sports, extreme sodas, extreme soap, everything, right? Because we've lost our ability to feel in some ways and to be connected with, because we've abstracted so much. So this is part of, we're trying to find our way back in, and these extremes are ways to sort of jostle it, allegedly. So one of the front edges of talking about cognition, because this is so much of what we talk about in education, about thinking, right? We want our students to think critically and creatively, is, and in many ways, the history of cognition has been one that's really reinforced and reified this idea of abstraction. But the front edge of it is what's called two things. One is embodied cognition. We've suddenly realized in the last 10 years that cognition doesn't just take place in the head or in abstraction. The other part of this that goes with embodied cognition is what's called 4E cognition. E is an elephant, 4E. And those 4 E's are enacted, extended, embedded, and embodied. And by the way, I'll put up my my email address, and I'll be happy to send you a copy of this chapter, which has this stuff in it. So you don't have to waste your time taking notes or whatever, if that's useful. And there'll be references and so forth if you want. So that 4E, so enacted, embodied, extended, embedded. Very simply, enacted means more of a constructivist approach, that thinking comes out of the exchange in many ways. Extended, it's not just us. That notion of intersecting like those soldiers, for example, in some ways. Embedded, we're embedded in culture, we're embedded in our language, we're embedded in our particular history, and again, embodied, which is the important part today. Okay. So one of the things, of course, one of the reasons I wanted to do this as opposed to something else today had to do with the amount of screen time we have, and algorithms and AI and so forth, and the fact that this is a remote conference. I thought, well, okay, let's we've had the last 18 months largely remote in many cases, at least. And so how do we have the body in the middle of this? So let me, oops. Okay, let me ask you a question, if I may, and that is, if you could just take a breath and settle into your chair. We'll just do this for a moment or so, and let gravity do its work. Let your chair do its work. And let me ask you a question. And Renee knows this question. And the question is, where are you now? Where are you now? Just notice where you are. A lot of different ways to answer this. Just tune in for a moment. Maybe thinking about something that happened. Maybe thinking about the future. Maybe thinking existentially, where am I in my life right now? You may notice where you are in your body. Are you in your head? Do you notice something tense in your torso? Just allow that to be here for just a moment. Okay. Come on back, if you would. I changed bells in case you didn't notice. So how many of you, just fingers or hands, how many of you noticed that you were doing a lot of thinking? Yeah, great. Thinking about anything in the past? No. How about future? Yeah, future. Yeah. How about existentially? Where you think about where you were in your life right now? Anybody? So yeah. How about your body? Did you notice some things in your body? Yeah, yeah. Some tight places or tension maybe, or some activation. So this move is so simple and it's so fundamental. And again, you imagine a child or an adult coming into a classroom, and they're bringing in their day, they're bringing in their history, they're bringing in their future, everything is there. And so simply a moment, and we took maybe 90 seconds, it didn't take more than that, to just drop in for a moment and notice. And so what this does is quickly send a couple messages. One, take a deep breath, you tell the autonomic nervous system to calm down, calm down. And that begins to prepare a safe space internally and externally for the prefrontal cortex basically to come online. If you're busy with stuff, all of you can't come online. So that's one thing it does. The other thing it does, though, is it invites, and again, in this world of subject object, of making things abstract, of outside ourselves, it comes back and it values, it sends a meta message about valuing subjectivity, about valuing your experience. And then it does another thing, all in 90 seconds. It does another thing, and that is it gets you to begin to tune in to the body. to notice. So this mindfulness, essentially. And folks, sometimes I'll say, okay, well, you might want to, you go through your day. Anytime you take a drink of something, Catherine, anytime you take a drink of something, you might ask yourself the same question: where am I now? Just as a check-in. Anytime your phone rings, rather than say, oh, who's that? Do I want to talk to them? It's like, where am I now? Just for a millisecond, just for a couple seconds before you move into the next one. You can't remember anytime you brush your teeth. Same thing. So, and what this does in a very understated and simply inviting way is plant a seed that students will often come back with, and I'll often, somebody will pass, me in a hallway or back in the old days, or maybe in a restaurant or something, and they'll point their finger out and they'll say, hey, who has had me in the car, where are you now? And I'll say, you got it, way to go. So, but again, it's very, very simple, very invasive. But again, it sends several messages all at once. Body, your subjectivity is of value, and just settle down a little bit, just settle in. This is all about priming, just as all the stuff in the beginning we did was priming. When you're focused, work can work so efficiently. You can do 3 hours of work in 50 minutes if you're really locked in. But you also know when, we're reading something and you're sort of not into it, or something's distracting, and 20 minutes goes by and say, damn, I just cannot remember what those last 3 pages were, right? So skill set and knowledge base is completely and utterly at the mercy of mindset. And all the things we're doing is sort of setting up, or in psychology, priming for a mindset that is appropriate for the task. So anyway, so let's keep going. So one of the things that, you okay so far? It's okay, I'm talking a lot, sorry. But one of the things that happens as we're learning is that, and growing just as from infants on, is differentiation. In fact, there are really 2 processes that happen as we grow. One is differentiation and the other is integration. So when we decide that a color is yellow, and then we differentiate between banana and butter and sun and something else, Claire and Anastasia, she's doing that already, lots, she's done that already. So she's making these differentiations. But then, and we integrate those, we put them into a schema, as Piaget would say, about yellow. One of the things that happens, though, is that as we go along and move up this ladder, we've been enculturated to tend towards more and more and more differentiation. And we begin to lose some of the integration, particularly the integration of more, or I should say, earlier evolved pieces of consciousness. So for example, in Piaget, we can think about sensory motor stuff. We can think about concrete rather than moving just to formal operational thinking. So one of the things that a guy named Werner did in the late 50s is he would talk about the value of moving back and forth between abstraction, concrete experience, sensory motor experience, in and out. And he called this microgenetic mobility. Microgenetic, in the moment, a micro experience. So if you have an idea, if we think of a scene right now, any scene out in nature, let's say, think of a scene in nature right now, concretely. And you might describe it concretely. There's a tree and there's a lake and there's a, whatever it is. And then we might say, okay, well, what are all the details? What are the pieces of that? Who's around? What's the temperature? And then you might move into sensory motor. What's the temperature of that? What's the wind feel like? What do you notice in your body about this? And then you might move up to formal operational. What does this remind you of? How do you make sense of this scene? Oh, well, fall is coming. Makes me think of fall and the associations with that. So what Werner said is that and there's some good evidence of this, is that creative folks that think in ways that are innovative, that move past habitual thinking and so forth, whether they be young people or otherwise, have an increase in what he called microgenetic mobility. So they're able to move really quickly in a second back from that gut feel. Where are you now? What's going on in your gut right now? What does your body say about this? You just finished a piece of writing. How's that feel to you? Well, it's, we don't make decisions based, oh yeah, it's done. I've got 5,000 words now, I'm done. It's like, something doesn't feel right. Something doesn't feel right. So we're moving back and forth. Think of it as even climbing up and down Piaget's ladder constantly. And by the way, this is something that we do in psychotherapy. For example, we can talk about as developmental psychotherapy. You might ask somebody, and again, it's the same in education. You might ask them something concrete. Tell me a concrete story about something, and then tell me how it feels, or tell me the story in a way that is more microgenetically mobile. It was a dark and stormy night. And instantly we're drawn into it in a way. How do you make sense of this? Formal operational reasoning. Back and forth. When folks just talk about something, they stay up in this world of abstraction. They tend to philosophize, whether this is in psychotherapy or in the classroom. But when they can bring in the subjectivity, when they can bring in the body in some way, then it becomes rich. The story becomes a dark and stormy night instead of just a night. And we live in stories. We don't live in lists. So anyway, this is part of the value of this in a very sort of down to earth way. There are other ways too. We might talk about somebody, and we know how to do this, right? You've got a project, and you might ask somebody to draw a solution to the project rather than simply tell me an answer to it. Or how would this move? Or if it were, you can use different sensory modalities, right? What do you hear when you talk about this or think about this? What does it sound like? What does it move like? What does it feel like? So anyway, you know these pieces. We're sort of biased towards images, right? So, okay. So
And Tobin, if that, I wish I had it in front of me, but you reminded me of Dan Richefin, his book on mindful education, and he talks about working with high school students and helping them understand Piaget's level, and that those developmental and embodying those. And each of them has a chess set in front of them. And he has them start off with a sensory motor approach to the chess set. So they're like putting the pieces in their mouth and so on, and then moving up through those levels to formal operational.
That's great. Yeah. One of my favorite sort of things that I'm usually with university students is, we'll do something that's kind of complex and let's say in personality or something. And I'll say, okay, everybody, here's Play-Doh. You all get a small piece of Play-Doh, and I want you to make an answer to the question of this, whatever it is that we're doing in some way. And, people will sort of giggle and start to throw, and, undergrads or whatever. And then you'll see this drop in, and it's a clear evidence of a state shift. So they go from sort of abstract reasoning and floating around and all to the kinesthetic, the tactile in a way that's really remarkable. And suddenly they become, you know, these children, and they become these artists, and they become, and so you know, similar to what you were saying, Renee, and it's amazing. And then I'll say, okay, you know, tell me about this, or write to me about this. And again, we do the same thing with a drawing. You can do the same thing in movement. Again, anything to get the body on the job, anything to sort of expand the horizon and the stretch of that abstract, linguistic, categorical thought process, which is remarkable, but remarkably incomplete. So one of the things that we can talk about is the mind and the body. And so mind-body medicine, for example, since really since the 70s, well, since Freud in some ways, right? So has recognized that the body and the mind are inseparable. Candace Pert discovered these proteins that are associated with thinking that were only in the brain, we thought, neuropeptides and the receptor sites, and she discovered them in the gut. She began to wrote a book called The Molecules of Emotion in 1980. And she said, my gosh, I can't make any meaningful distinction between the brain and the rest of the body anymore, because these things that we know are associated with higher order thought are distributed in the pancreas and in the hand and in the gut, especially. So we discover this remarkable distinction. So, and yet our metaphors in the West, at least, mostly are about thinking takes place in the head. So what we know is, for example, the biggest, we think of the biggest electromagnetic generator in the body is the heart, for example. So let's just do another thing for 30 seconds. So take a breath again, if you would, if you're comfortable. I'll ring my little bell. And just bring to heart, bring to your chest a little more spaciousness. Just see if you can bring your awareness right into your chest. And if you're able, think of something or someone that you love or appreciate. That's all. Someone or something that you love or appreciate. Just bring them to heart and mind. And my guess is most of you are able to find something or someone. It might be a dog. It might be Claire. It might be who knows what. And as just to close the loop, maybe you'll want to take a moment and just send them the affection and the appreciation that you have. So just in your mind, in your imagination, in your heart, just send in whatever way that love. Okay. So were you all able to find something or someone? Yeah. So it doesn't take much, right? And for kids to drop in, it's again another way just to move out of abstraction into subjectivity, into body. One of the things we know, for example, in addition to the heart, is that this, as Candace Pert discovered, the gut is a place of knowing. And we even have a term for it. It's called the enteric nervous system. And it isn't just receiving things, it actually generates things. So one of the things that we've discovered, and William James recognized this 120 years ago, is that we usually think that thought comes first and it generates a feeling and a felt sense and then a body reaction. Oh my gosh, that's a scary thing. And then it goes down. It actually, there's as much evidence that says it doesn't happen that way. Instead, that the body responds first. And then you have a vague sort of sense of something, a kind of a gut intuition. And then you have a felt sense. And then you have a feeling. And then you have a vague concept. And then you have the thought, oh, it's a tiger. So this is radically different than the way that we think things occur. And if this is the case, then it fuels us right to sort of tune into that body, because as soon as we recognize that gut feeling, then we've got an intuitive sense before all the distortion that comes up and the noise that we add to it that comes to the thought. So if we can come closer to the bone of our lived experience, then we're more accurate in our perception. Our interpretation isn't just generated by pre-existing categories. And in fact, what we know is that most of the nerves, 95% of the nerves, come into the right hemisphere. John earlier today mentioned Ian McGilchrist's wonderful work, his book called The Master and His Emissary, that talk about the left and right hemispheres, left and right mind, we can say. And much of the left mind, I'm going to talk about it as mind and not brain, but left mind is what we do in schools with abstraction, categorical understanding, linear linguistic processing. And the right is where we'll do much more visual, much more felt sense, much more intuitive feel, much more connective. It's much more the way that Renee is talking about organization. It's a much more dynamic, emergent, systemic, circular, bidirectional, multi-directional kind of process rather than the singular. And that's what the right hemisphere does. The right hemisphere does metaphor. The right hemisphere does relationship. The right hemisphere does this kind of connectivity. It does empathy in a way. And it appreciates what the left can do. The trouble is, according to McGilchrist, that the left, this abstract conceptualization, cannot appreciate the other. And yet he says this is what's running the country and the world, and he would say ruining it. Fascinating book, wonderful stuff, if you can see it. Anyway, and I came to him late. I came to him sort of after some of these. So for me, it was a lot of validation. It's like, yes, yes, yes. Here's a way of talking about some things that a lot of us have known. So this is also this idea of location, body location is fascinating. St. Bonaventure talked about 3 eyes of knowing. Pythagoras talked about 3 centers of knowing. One is the gut, the dantian, in Asian tradition. Another is the heart, and another is here. And so another exercise, and maybe we won't have time to do this. Oh my goodness. Wait, what time are we ending?
1:50.
Oh gosh, okay. Yeah, we're like about a 10th of the way through. So, but fascinating, and it's fun to have kids do this, is to have them construct an issue. What's an issue? You could say a problem, but what's an issue you're wrestling with? Or maybe it's a topic, or maybe it's a school assignment. Doesn't matter what it is. And invite them to get relaxed and to see it from their gut, and then to have a little mental sorbet, a little clearing of the palate, and then to see it from their heart, and then to see it from here. And it's fascinating for them to describe what those differences are. You don't have to preordain what they are. A couple more really quick things, and then we'll be done here, or I'll be done. Is Eugene Gendlin's stuff on focusing or inner listening. Very, very, very wonderful. And that idea of where are you now is a way to tune into this inner world. Anything to do with the senses is another way too. John mentioned observation. So anything we can do to say, wow, can you feel that? Can you see that? Can you taste that? Can you touch that? Can you describe it? So we don't have to go in, we can go out, and both are a pathway to the same thing. Kingsley says, look, the Greeks seem to say that the senses were unreliable, but what they really said were that they're unstarted, they're undeveloped, and it requires of us practice to develop that sort of sensitivity so that we can have this more powerfully robust source of knowledge. So the body isn't just convenient, it is this powerful source. It's a way of knowing, anyway. So we can talk about synesthesia, we can then talk about the embodied embeddedness in the world, we can talk about John Muir, and we can talk about hands-on, the doing, the notion of craftsmanship, the notion of a classroom as a craftsman's workshop, about the power of place and how we use whatever is at hand. If we're in a farm community, that's embodiment. We use what's at hand to do that, and on and on. So anyway, thanks so much. This went too quickly for me, probably too slowly for you. So if there's maybe a couple minutes here, anything you want to say, just jump in, and Julissa will usher us out in a moment or two. And again, if you'd like, I'm going to put my email up right now, and just email me, and I'll be happy to send you an article, a chapter.